Dr. Michael Harrison sat in the climate-controlled archives of the Library of Congress on a February afternoon in 2024, reviewing a newly digitized collection of Old West photographs. The institutions had been working for years to preserve and catalog these fragile windows into America's past, and Michael's expertise in frontier history made him an ideal consultant for the project. He had spent 15 years studying the American frontier, examining thousands of photographs that documented the expansion westward. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover. The image before him seemed utterly ordinary at first glance. Dated September 1881, it showed a typical day in Dodge City, Kansas, one of the most famous cattle towns of the American West. The main street stretched across the frame, lined with wooden buildings that spoke of rapid construction, contemporary prosperity. A general store with barrels stacked on the porch, a bank with painted windows, a two-story hotel with a broad balcony overlooking the street. The dirt road bustled with the activity of frontier life. A supply wagon loaded with goods stood near the mercantile, its driver apparently inside conducting business. Two women in long dresses walked along the wooden sidewalk carrying parasols to shield themselves from the intense Kansas sun. Several cowboys moved about their business with the casual confidence of men accustomed to this rough environment. 3 horses were tied to a hitching post outside what appeared to be a saloon, their heads lowered as they waited patiently for their riders. The bright sky and sharp, well-defined shadows suggested the photograph had been taken around midday when the light was strongest. Michael had examined thousands of such photographs during his 30-year career. They were valuable historical documents, certainly, but rarely did they contain surprises. They documented everyday frontier existence, commerce, movement, civilization taking root in wild territory. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would make headlines or change historical understanding. But as he prepared to move to the next image in the collection, something made him pause. In the lower right corner of the photograph, partially obscured by the edge of a water trough, stood a cowboy. Michael carefully positioned the photograph under the archive's high-resolution scanner, his curiosity now fully awakened. The equipment was state-of-the-art, capable of revealing details invisible to the naked eye, even in photographs nearly 150 years old. The technology could extract information from historical images that photographers from over a century ago never intended to capture, pulling hidden stories from faded emulsions and aging paper. As the scanning process completed and the digital file opened on his computer monitor, he began zooming systematically through the busy street scene, examining each section with professional thoroughness. The women with parasols, resolved into sharper focus, he could now make out the intricate patterns on their dresses, the delicate lace trim on their sleeves, even the expressions on their partially visible faces. The horses at the hitching post became individuals rather than blurs, their distinctive markings visible, their tack and saddles clearly detailed with tooled leather and silver concos. The store signs sharpened dramatically, revealing advertisements for tobacco products, hardware supplies, and dry goods. Everything appeared exactly as expected from a frontier town photograph. Ordinary, documentary, unremarkable. Then he zoomed in on the cowboy standing in the lower right corner. The man's face remained partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, but his clothing became distinct and clear. Worn denim pants with visible patches, a leather vest over a light-colored shirt, typical boots with large rowel spurs that marked him as someone who worked with horses. And there, positioned at his right hip in a well-worn holster, was the revolver that had first caught Michael's attention. Colt's single-action army, the iconic peacemaker that had become synonymous with the American frontier. But it was the revolver's handle that made Michael's breath catch in his throat and his hands begin to tremble. As the image enlarged further, the weapon came into focus with startling, undeniable clarity. The grip appeared to be custom-made, and as he increased magnification to the maximum the image resolution would allow, he saw that it wasn't crafted from standard wood or cattle horn, as was typical for the period. Carved into the handle were small, deliberate marks, notches, or grooves arranged in neat, organized rows. Michael spent 3 sleepless nights studying the enhanced photograph, unable to shake the image of that revolver from his mind. He had made multiple high-resolution prints and dozens of digital copies, examining every pixel from different angles and under various lighting adjustments, desperately trying to convince himself that he was wrong about what he was seeing. But the evidence remained consistent, no matter how many times he reviewed it. The handle showed unmistakable characteristics of carved bone, the texture, the subtle grain pattern, the way it had been shaped and polished. And those 23 notches were too deliberate, too carefully organized into groups of 5, with diagonal lines crossing each complete group, to be random decoration or accidental damage. On the 4th day, unable to continue alone with this discovery, he contacted Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a forensic anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution, who had occasionally consulted on historical cases where human remains were involved. They met at a quiet cafe near the National Mall, where Michael spread the photographs across their corner table, his hands shaking slightly as he arranged them in order of magnification. "I need you to tell me I'm imagining things," he said, pointing to the enhanced image of the revolver. "Tell me this is just old ivory or cattle bone, something ordinary, that I'm misinterpreting because I've been staring at it for too long." Elena studied the photograph in silence for several minutes, pulling out a professional magnifying loupe from her bag to examine the finest details more closely. She adjusted the angle of the print under the cafe's overhead light, studying the texture and grain pattern of the grip, material with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades working with skeletal remains. When she finally looked up from her examination, her expression was grave, and Michael knew his worst fears were about to be confirmed. "You're not imagining it, Michael," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one nearby was listening. "That's definitely bone. Based on the texture, the way the grain runs, and how it's been shaped and finished, I'd say human bone with a high degree of confidence. Probably carved from a femur, or possibly a large arm bone something, with enough mass and density to carve grip panels that would be durable enough for regular use." Michael traveled to Topeka, Kansas, where the Kansas State Historical Society maintained extensive archives of frontier-era documents in a modern facility designed specifically for preservation of fragile historical materials. The archivist, a patient and knowledgeable man named Robert, who had worked with the collection for over 20 years, helped him navigate the vast collection of newspapers, legal records, sheriff's reports, and personal correspondence from Dodge City during the early 1880s. The archives were remarkably complete, offering an unusually detailed window into daily life in one of the West's most notorious cattle towns. Dodge City in 1881 was at the absolute peak of its reputation as a wide-open cattle town, the kind of place that would become legend in American culture. Thousands upon thousands of Texas Longhorns arrived each season during the great cattle drives, driven up from ranches hundreds of miles south by cowboys who were paid at the end of the trail and were desperate, even to spend their hard-earned money after months of brutal work and isolation on the trail. The city's numerous saloons, gambling halls, and brothels operated around the clock to accommodate this influx of men with cash in their pockets and a hunger for entertainment. Violence was common and often dismissed as inevitable fistfights outside saloons, shootings over card games, stabbings in dark alleys, but most of it was attributed to drunkenness, quick tempers, and the rough nature of frontier life rather than premeditated murder or organized crime. Michael began his research with the Dodge City Times, the town's primary newspaper. methodically reading through every single issue from 1880 through 1882. The newspapers were filled with the usual content of frontier journalism, advertisements for patent medicines and dry goods, social announcements of marriages and arrivals, political commentary about territorial governance, and reports of typical frontier incidents. But as he worked carefully through the months of 1881, recording every mention of violence or unexplained death, a disturbing pattern began to emerge that made his skin crawl and his stomach tighten with growing horror. In March 1881, the body of a drifter named Thomas Sullivan was found in a narrow alley behind the Alhambra Saloon, one of the town's rougher establishments. The newspaper reported that he had been shot once in the back of the head at close range. Execution-style.Michael created a detailed timeline of the murders, carefully cross-referencing newspaper accounts with coroner's reports and whatever sheriff's records still existed in the archives. What emerged from this painstaking reconstruction was a chilling portrait of a methodical killer who understood exactly how to exploit the chaos, violence, and social prejudices of frontier life to conceal his crimes and avoid detection. This wasn't someone killing in rage or desperation. This was calculated, organized, and terrifyingly efficient. The victims had been chosen with careful deliberation, selected according to a pattern that revealed the killer's intelligence and understanding of frontier social dynamics. They were all people existing on society's margins, individuals whose lives were considered less valuable by the standards of the time, drifters passing through town with no family connections or permanent addresses, prostitutes working in the red light district south of the railroad tracks, immigrant workers from China and Mexico who faced constant discrimination, young cowboys far from home with no one to miss them if they disappeared. These were individuals whose disappearances might not even be noticed immediately, whose deaths would generate minimal investigation from authorities who had limited resources and many other concerns, whose murders could be easily dismissed as the unfortunate but inevitable cost of living in a rough frontier environment. The methods of killing varied considerably: shooting, stabbing, strangulation, blunt force trauma, which had been crucial in preventing authorities from recognizing a pattern or connecting the deaths to a single perpetrator. But Michael noticed something that the original investigators, working without modern criminal profiling techniques or forensic science, had completely missed. Despite the varying methods, all the victims had been killed in isolated locations, carefully chosen spots away from potential witnesses. The bodies were typically discovered hours or even days after death, which made it extremely difficult to establish precise times of death or identify suspects who might have been seen in the area. Dr. Rodriguez flew to Kansas to examine the coroner's reports with Michael, bringing her forensic expertise to the historical investigation. The documents were frustratingly sparse. Frontier medical examiners rarely performed thorough autopsies, and their reports often consisted of little more than a brief cause of death and some general observations about the body's condition. But Elena, trained to extract maximum information from minimal evidence, found crucial details that confirmed their theory and revealed the killer's nature. Identifying the man in the photograph proved considerably more challenging than Michael had initially anticipated. The image was clear enough to show that he carried the distinctive revolver with its bone-carved grips, and the enhancement had revealed details of his clothing and posture. But his face remained frustratingly obscured by the shadow cast by the brim of his hat. Michael enlisted the help of Dr. James Wu, a facial reconstruction specialist who worked with law enforcement agencies on cold cases and had pioneered techniques for enhancing historical photographs using advanced digital imaging technology and artificial intelligence algorithms trained on thousands of period photographs. Process took weeks of painstaking work. Dr. Wu adjusted lighting values, digitally compensated for shadow patterns, analyzed the bone structure visible in the partially lit portions of the face, and used comparative analysis with other photographs from the same period, and location to fill in missing details with reasonable accuracy. The result was a composite image that showed a man in his mid-30s with a lean, angular face that suggested hardness and perhaps cruelty. A dark mustache trimmed in the style that was popular during the early 1880s, and what appeared to be notably cold. Pale eyes that seemed to stare through the camera rather than at it. Michael circulated the enhanced image among historians, genealogists, and researchers specializing in frontier Kansas history, posting it on academic forums and sending it to historical societies throughout the region, hoping desperately that someone might recognize the face or find it in their own collections of family photographs or local archives. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source several weeks later. A descendant researcher named Patricia Brennan, who was researching her own family history and had been following discussions about frontier crime on a historical society forum, contacted Michael after seeing the image he had posted. "I've seen that face before," Patricia wrote in her detailed email, "in a family photograph album that belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Morton. She ran a boarding house in Dodge City throughout the 1880s, and she kept albums with photographs of many of her tenants over the years. There's a group photograph from around 1881 that includes several of her boarders, and one of the men in that picture looks remarkably similar to your composite image. Same facial structure, same style of mustache, same distinctive posture that seems both relaxed and alert at the same time." Michael dove into researching William Crane with renewed focus and determination, knowing that understanding the killer's background might provide crucial context for his crimes and possibly reveal whether he had killed before arriving in Dodge City. The name was common enough that finding reliable records required painstaking cross-referencing and careful verification of details across multiple sources. But gradually, piece by piece, a biography emerged from the scattered documents of frontier bureaucracy census records, military service files, employment ledgers, and city directories that together painted a picture of a man who had deliberately left almost no trace of his existence. William Crane had been born in Missouri in 1847, which made him 34 years old during the 1881 murders in Dodge City, a mature adult, not a young hothead, which made his crimes even more chilling in their calculation. Military records showed he had served briefly in the Union Army during the final year of the Civil War, enlisting in early 1865, when the Confederacy was already collapsing and the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. His service had been entirely unremarkable. No commendations, no disciplinary actions, no notable incidents recorded, and he was discharged in late 1865 when his unit was mustered out following the Confederate surrender. After the war, like millions of other veterans, both Union and Confederate, he had drifted westward, appearing sporadically in census records, city directories, and county registries across Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado throughout the 1860s and 1870s. He had worked various jobs, typical of transient frontier laborers: ranch hand, freight wagon driver, occasional prospector trying his luck in various mining districts, stable worker, and general laborer. The pattern was consistent. He never stayed in one place longer than a year or two, never put down roots, never formed lasting connections. There were no marriage records attached to his name, no property holdings or land claims, no evidence of family or close friends. He moved through the American West like a ghost, leaving almost no trace of his existence beyond his name, appearing briefly in occasional employment ledgers or boarding house registers before he disappeared again, moving on to the next town The next temporary job? The next anonymous room? What was most notable and deeply significant about Crane's history was what was absent from it. There was no record of arrest or criminal activity anywhere in his background before arriving in Dodge City in 1881. The last entry in Michael's carefully constructed timeline of Dodge City murders was dated January 8, 1882, and it marked a significant departure from the killer's previous pattern of victim selection. A young woman named Alice Pemberton, who worked as a seamstress at one of the town's more respectable dress shops, had been found dead in a small storage room behind the establishment where she was employed. She had been strangled, and her body showed clear signs of having been moved after death. She had been killed elsewhere, possibly in a more isolated location, and then transported and carefully positioned in the storage room where she would eventually be discovered by her horrified employer. The newspaper coverage of Alice Pemberton's death had been considerably more extensive than that given to the previous victims, primarily because she was considered a respectable young woman rather than a prostitute, drifter, or member of a marginalized immigrant community. The Dodge City Times had devoted several prominent columns to the murder over multiple issues, describing Alice as a virtuous young woman of good character and expressing outrage that such a crime could occur in their community. The sheriff had publicly promised a thorough investigation and appealed for any witnesses to come forward. A substantial reward of $50, significant sum that represented more than 2 months' wages for a typical laborer, was offered by prominent citizens for information, leading to the killer's arrest and conviction. According to the boarding house ledger maintained by Patricia, Brennan's great-great-grandmother, William Crane had checked out of his room on January 15, 1882, exactly 1 week after Alice Pemberton's body was discovered, and at a time when the investigation was intensifying and public pressure for an arrest was mounting. He had paid all his outstanding rent without complaint, collected his few belongings from the small room he had occupied for nearly 10 months, and departed Dodge City without indicating where he was going or leaving any forwarding information. His landlady had noted in her ledger simply, W. Crane departed, paid in full, no destination given. Michael found what happened next in a newspaper from Pueblo, Colorado, located about 300 miles southwest of Dodge City. The Pueblo Chieftain, dated February 2, 1882, contained a brief article tucked into the back pages among various minor news items about a drifter who had been killed in a confrontation with local law enforcement. The Pueblo Police Museum occupied a modest space in the basement of the department's headquarters, a single large room filled with glass display, cases and locked storage cabinets containing artifacts from the city's law enforcement history stretching back to its founding in the 1840s. The curator, an enthusiastic retired detective named Frank Morrison, who had spent 30 years with the department before dedicating his retirement to preserving its history, led Michael to a locked cabinet positioned in the back corner of the room, away from the main displays that tourists and school groups typically viewed. "This is our oldest evidence collection," Frank explained as he selected a key from the large ring he carried and carefully unlocked the cabinet's door. "Items from cases in the 1880s and 1890s mostly. We've kept everything that seemed historically significant or particularly unusual, even though obviously the cases themselves are long closed and everyone involved is long dead." He reached into the cabinet and pulled out a wooden box, its surface darkened with age and marked with faded ink that read, "Crane 1882 officer involved shooting." He carried the box reverently to a large examination table positioned under bright overhead lights and carefully set it down. Inside the box, wrapped in layers of deteriorating cloth that had once been white, but had yellowed to a tea-stained brown over the decades. Was the revolver that had haunted Michael's thoughts for months. Michael's hands trembled, noticeably as he carefully photographed the weapon from every angle before touching it, documenting its condition and position in the box. Following proper archival procedures, even though this was evidence from a case nearly 150 years old. The Colt single-action Army was in remarkable condition considering its age, its metal showing the patina of time, but no significant rust or serious damage. The mechanism still appeared functional, though obviously no one had test-fired it in over a century. But it was the grips that demanded attention and made Michael's stomach clench with revulsion. The same bone-carved handles that were visible in the 1881 photograph, now seen in 3 dimensions in perfect, undeniable detail under the museum's bright, fluorescent lights. There was no longer any possibility of doubt or alternative explanation. The grips were unmistakably carved from human bone, carefully shaped and polished to fit precisely onto the revolver's frame. The 23 notches were clearly visible, arranged in their systematic groups of 5, with diagonal marks crossing each complete group a tally system. A scoreboard of murder. The DNA testing process took 3 long months of careful laboratory work. Dr. Rodriguez collaborated with a specialized laboratory that had extensive experience extracting genetic material from historical specimens and ancient remains, using techniques developed for archaeological research and adapted for forensic applications. The bone material from the revolver grip had been degraded by time, handling, and environmental exposure, making extraction difficult, but the laboratory staff were among the best in their field. The results, when they finally came back, confirmed what Michael and Elena had already known in their hearts, but needed to prove scientifically. The grips were carved from human femoral bone, and remarkably, enough mitochondrial DNA had been preserved to allow for comparison testing. The genetic profile matched descendants of one of the 1881 victims, the unidentified Mexican cowhand who had been found dead near the Dodge City Railroad tracks and buried in an unmarked grave with barely a mention. In the local newspaper, Michael published his comprehensive findings in the Journal of American Criminal History in October 2024, in an extensively detailed article titled "The Bone-Handled Revolver: Evidence of Serial Murder in Dodge City, 1881 to 1882. The article included the enhanced photographs showing both the original street scene and close-ups of the weapon. Complete documentation of the 23 murders with victim profiles and timelines. The biographical research on William Crane revealing his movements and background. And the forensic analysis of the weapon itself, including the DNA results that conclusively identified the grip material. The story exploded across national media within days of publication. Featured on news programs, discussed on countless podcasts, and shared millions of times across social media platforms. The photograph of Crane walking casually down a busy Dodge City street in bright daylight, carrying openly on his hip a weapon made from his victim's remains, became an iconic and deeply disturbing image that appeared everywhere in television documentaries about frontier violence, in updated American history textbooks, in true crime publications, and in museum exhibits about the darker aspects of westward expansion. The revolver itself was transferred to the Smithsonian Institution's collection, where it became the centerpiece of a thoughtful exhibit on frontier violence, criminal history, and the victims who had been forgotten by their own time, but were finally being remembered and honored. Michael worked tirelessly with victims' advocacy, groups, and historical societies to create permanent memorials for Crane's 23 known victims.